Yeah, thank you so very much for inviting me. I'm glad to be here. It is always a question of how to open a festival like this, a festival with this history, and also a context in which we want to think together about thinking together, in which we want to think together about what could it mean to know something that we don't know yet. I propose to enter this question with this concept of negotiating with reality. I want to do this here in this lecture as well, so I see this also a bit as an improvisation. I see it as a way to start a collective thinking process that will happen in the next days here. So instead of presenting you something completely done, I want to bring some ideas. I prepared some, let's say, hesitations also that could invite to relate, to find connection points, and that would rather be a beginning to think something than a very well worked through starting lecture for today. Negotiating with reality as a title is related to the fact, I mean, we have heard that already in the introductory words, that many people in the arts and in curatorial, let's say, intellectual practices feel that it makes sense to think research differently, that there is a maybe ongoing commodification of research in the existing universities, that research very often also remains something that either is very much already organized in what we already know, or highly expected to be innovative. And beside that, or in between that, how can we actually think together? Negotiating with reality is, I try to call a way to be within this, and neither to flee it nor to completely embrace it, but to see that this intellectual practice is going anyway, can go anyway, and then I want to think about how. So with other words, I want to ask the question how we can learn something that we don't know yet. And even if this sounds like a paradox, this is actually what research is all about. And in recent years, several post-representational, curatorial and artistic endeavors and forms of practice-based research have tried to encounter this paradox. So I'm looking at some of them, I want to think about them, I want to think with you, so I will talk more or less, I think, around 50 minutes, so that we have then also time for questions and answers and actually really think together. So many things will remain open, you will have many questions, I hope, and then we see where we can go on from there. I want to locate what I will present between representation, presence, and pre-presentation. I would like to locate it there because I became, in the last 6 years, when I started, let's say, a research context that I defined to be about post-representational curating, I became more and more suspicious about my own topic. So let me just tell you a bit what I mean with these words and how it happened that I became suspicious. Looking for the post-representational seemed to make sense in a world of museums and institutions that have been, since many years, criticized for their representational Western mode of being, but have been pretty untouched at the same time, especially structurally by this criticism. So to think about what could happen after representation was also a way of trying to think and act in solidarity with the history of struggles against the existing powerful representations. So the questions that I was actually entering this process where what could curating be if it is not about representation, neither about the representation of groups, of schools, of tendencies, of families, not about the representations of nations, not even about the representation of the criticism of representation, but about something else than representation. And of course, looking for that, and gathering different examples coming from activism, coming from curatorial artistic strategies. What one can encounter are points of intersections to many fields, to the performative, the discursive, to the choreographical, now in this context we could say to the sonic. What we encounter has been also, let's say, put into boxes with the name of turns. So, of course, we have heard about all these turns, the educational turn, the discursive turn, the choreographic turn. Maybe we are in the middle of the sonic turn now, after the last documenta, but even this putting it into turns should make us suspicious. What does it mean? I mean, we feel there is a problem going on. There has been an ongoing struggle against powerful knowledges, and then in the moment when institution cannot remain as it is in somehow belittling this impossibility to go on into these little turns. And so this was one of the moments where the suspicion started. I was asking myself also if this turning things into turns is not also calling us into becoming the mobilization machines for the neoliberal transformation of the institutions. I have to tell you that when I came to Helsinki 6 years ago, it was already, the university I was going to was already a corporate, but it was still working very much under the freedom and the logic of the welfare state public university. This is not so much the case anymore. So while I had the freedom to think about all this, and while we were all the time turning, we turned into something that is now, I could really say, less free than it was 6 years ago. So I realized, is there maybe something that is pushing us away from representation? And is this what is pushing us away from representation maybe also complicit with the neoliberal transformation process of the public institutions? Is there maybe also an interest in making us suspicious about them? Because actually they are in a process of being sold out. And how can I not be in alliance or less be in alliance or in a critical alliance with this neoliberal transformation process and at the same time more be in solidarity with these struggles against the existing powerful representations? From in somehow also having been pushed into presence, I started to think about a possibility to think representation and presence together in a certain way. And I will go through that during the lecture. And I started to be interested in how to insist and persist in not giving up also the relation to history, also the relation to critical reflexivity, even though we might have turned into a knowledge about being inside or into a need of affective relationality and so on. So this thinking representation and presence together within the existing institutions and situations became more and more important, and from there the future in somehow came up. So from there we also in Helsinki together started to think about how a possible imagination of a possible other future could be part of this. And from there, we started to think about para-institutions that would in somehow already imagine possible other institutions. And this I propose to call pre-presentation in the context of the lecture today. So as I said, the question is in somehow, how can we know something that we don't know yet? And to turn it into one of the interests of this academy, to turn it into the language of radical education, we could also ask, how can we learn something that doesn't exist yet? This even historically might be the classical question of emancipatory education, even of revolutionary education, because there is this dialectics between thinking revolution as the moment where everything changed, and thinking revolution as a process in which what will change has to be made thinkable in a more Gramscian sense of the word. In order to make thinkable what is not thinkable yet, we need these small steps, these long processes, and imagination, I would say, has a huge role in that. We have to learn something that doesn't exist yet. And how is this possible? This cannot be taught from above. It's impossible. We can only learn it from each other. And we all know something about something that doesn't exist yet. So in order to give some, I thought it makes sense here to give some examples of some curatorial, artistic, activist projects in the last years. And I will come back to them, especially to the one by etc. during the lecture. This is actually is a poster from 2008, but it is a demonstration from the 2000s during the crisis in Argentina. And it is by the artist collective, etc. It is a poster that shows the artists at a demonstration where they demonstrate with a question mark. And for me, this is a very good example for the possibility to, at the same time, taking a clear stance and insisting and persisting in remaining hesitant while taking the clear stance. So to go to a demonstration with a question mark is entering an antagonism. It means that you are on the side of the demonstration against the existing political hegemony. To go there with a question mark also means that any claim of this demonstration is discussable. So in somehow we can say that we live in a time, and I mean, where activism is not reflective. I think this imagination that I come to this also maybe from a discussion about if we have to admit that we are inside. Anyone who would imagine that there would be a possible outside would be unreflective, kind of. Yeah? So neither, what I want to say is neither, for reflection, we neither have to be completely outside, nor we have to be completely inside. It is possible to be completely inside and nevertheless question even the position itself. And I think this is in somehow, for me, where I would place this research perspective. And with this example from etc., of course, the name of the artist group, etc., is doing something similar with every artist list. It is intervening in something closed with a small intervention that is at the same time completely part of it and opening up for something unexpected. Yeah, the other examples here are, I mean, from 2013 in Istanbul. This was already the beginning of the turbo capitalization of the city, and the moment when a Roma settlement has been completely destroyed. A Roma settlement that existed there for thousands of years, longer than Istanbul in somehow, and part of the struggle of the people living there together with activists in Istanbul was to write their own history, to write the history of the destruction of the settlement and the history of the struggle against the destruction. And again here we have a moment of reflection and a moment of research and of with the tools of making visible what is going on in the very within of a struggle. The third example is from 2 years ago, from Casco in Utrecht, from the project Time and Tools for Commoning. just to bring in this ongoing work on how to learn together and how to think about learning as a process. I mean, I could say it now with the book The Undercommons by Stefano Hani and Fred Moten, a process of study, a process that can go on anyways, nevertheless, even if the university is completely capitalized, even if the societies we live in are racist or become more and more fascist, there is something in the knowledge that happens when we are together that cannot be silenced so easily. And to think about commoning also means that. It also means that means to bring the idea of the common back in a world that is more and more privatizing the public. And this is, of course, meaningful for universities and art institutions, because this is what is actually going on while we talk about critical thinking. Now, these are examples I'm familiar with. I'm not familiar with, not so familiar with examples of the field of, now I try the other one. I'm not so familiar with examples with the field of sound, and as I was invited to come here, and as I have now this new position in Kassel, I just took the opportunity to prepare for this, to think this together with some thoughts about scores at Documenta 14. And I owe here a lot, I have to say. I mean, I have to say even everything to Hendrik Volkerts. Hendrik Volkerts was was in the curatorial team of Documenta 14, and he brought in very interesting, also historical research and new perspectives on the idea of the score. And I would like to just refer to that a bit with some examples, with two examples, to start to relate what I could talk of from the field of education and the curatorial to debates in sound. So what Hendrik Volkers says in this text called Keeping Score, Notation, Embodiment and Liveness in the magazine South that was related to Documenta 14 is that what he proposes is to understand the score not as a representation but as a precursor for a future iteration with an unknown outcome. So for me this has an echo. This rereading of the score has an echo with the moment of pre-presentation that entered in our debates when we tried to think these moments of representation, post-representation and presence together. So when imagination came in and we started to think about the museum, the para-museum, not anymore only as a place to analyze critically, either to tell the story of what happened or to analyze critically how the story of what happened has been told, but as a place to imagine another possible future from looking at history. This way of thinking about the score had an echo. So I quote Volkerts when he approaches to a definition. He writes, "The score is a notational device that connects the material of a discipline ranging from music, dance and performance to architecture, linguistics, mathematics, physics, and its systems of knowledge to a language that produces description, transmission and signification in order to be read, enacted or executed in whatever form desirable." Now, he refers to an exhibition that happened in the MACBA in 2008, and that was called Possibility of Action, The Life of the Score. And yeah, I mean, as someone who is working in the theory and practice of curating and education in the last, let's say, 7, 8 or 10 years, this shift from representation to the possibility of action. So this was at some point even my definition of the post-representational, that curating could be about not what can be shown, but what can what can happen. And not in the sense of making something happen, but in the sense of creating a possibility of action. I mean, then I thought somehow it's really interesting to see that there is a perspective to the score, to the notation system, that would go in exactly the same direction, in a direction of looking at the possibility of action. Volkerts introduces the show, curated by Barbara Held and Pilar Subira, as a context that reversed the conventional understanding of a score as an abstract representation of tone, taking instead as their starting point Cage's contrary notion of the score as a representation of action with a unique and unpredictable result. And he introduces us to Cornelius Cadu, and talks about his method that was premised on a dissolution of the hierarchies and boundaries between composer and interpreter, as well as between performers active in different fields of performance, from music to visual art. The Scratch Orchestra had no fixed leader or conductor. Rather, everyone was equally involved and implicated in the enactment of the score. The orchestra consisted of both musicians and non-musicians, acting as one assembly in a collective state of continuous training and research. So again, here there was this moment of echo with this concept of study. And also it was interesting for me to relate to a history of sound. In somehow we can find here also a certain negotiating with reality, a way of people coming together and negotiate with each other and with with reality, also in the sense of the classical understanding of what we would understand by doing music together, and also what we would understand by a score. The second example is also I also totally owe it to Hendrik Volkerts, is Yanni Christou, who did similar radical experiments with music notation, and the possibilities therein for collectivity can be found in the and who did similar experiments, and who died in 1970. So Volkerts writes about the score for his late piece Epicycle in 1968, that it includes both written instructions and drawn images that describe how to spatialize and time the performance, all of which lead to the execution of a continuum, that is, a continuous space for performance that participants could step in and out of, and where potentially every observer could be cast as a performer. In his continuum scores, Christou sought the ultimative removal of the composer himself as author. What I think is here interesting, I mean, just, of course, the echo is a bit obvious, is that we have, and this is classical for the 70s, also in contemporary art, of course, we have a certain struggle with representation. It is this dream of coming out of the representational mode, in somehow a belief of being able to come out. But I like to look at it also from this other perspective that I have talked about, from the perspective of the crisis of presence. And in somehow it is beautiful when Documenta is bringing up this course. It's also insisting in the historicity of this perspective. We are looking for this not as something completely new, but as we look at it, and here I see a relation maybe even to the Third World Movement. We cannot imagine that to question the Western perspective of the world is something new. We are already the next generation. We have to go to it from a perspective that relates, neither nostalgic to it, not as a fantasy of innovation. We have to relate to it also as something that happened historically. So crisis of presence also in the sense of insisting and persisting in historicity and the historical material. And I see here the score also as a model itself that is as much archive as it is future potential. And back to our practice in the post-representational kind of research and curatorial experiments, I I would have situated them at some point in the middle, exactly at this interspace of representation and presence, in this interspace in which both, in which we don't give up on both, which I would say makes it possible that this moment of imagination comes up. I want to go a bit further with this. I mean, we talk about the history, we talk about a shift now. So there was a shift in the 60s, 70s, there's a shift now. And with this question mark, I already mentioned it. It might feel like these words, like reflection, exploration, investigation, intervention, imagination, might feel that they in somehow also are contradictory. So how can we reflect when we imagine? How can we intervene when we explore? And I would be interested in seeing our contemporary condition as being able to think them together. And I wanted to look a bit also at how this maybe changed. And I want to show it in the work of one artist. His name is, I mean, many of you might know him, Stephen Willard, who worked very similarly in the 70s as he is doing now. And that's why I think we can really well see the shift in the approach. So it was, I would say, we could say it was a research practice already in the 70s. At that time, it would have been called a conceptual practice. Obviously, it is highly informed by post-structuralist theory. This project is called What Made Me Like I Am, and obviously is based on the idea of reflection. It is based on the idea that we are, of course, I mean, I say it now with Foucault, as subjects, we are not autonomous, but we are subjected through many discourses that define us and make us who we are. Now, this could be a reflection, and I would say where we are now is that we want to not only understand the world, but to change it at the same time. So we don't want to say, on the one hand, there is a move of understanding, which would be the mode of reflection, and on the other hand, there would be the mode of change, revolution, or whatever. But I propose to think about an involved reflexivity and a reflexive intervention in which we can think both of these parts together. And it's interestingly enough, the same artist with a similar aesthetics in 2016 comes up or proposes a work that is called This Way, and again works with interviews and again makes this sociological perspective visible. But that now, 2016, this was in Stockholm and was in London later, he's interested in what made people move. He's interested in the possibility for change. So I just read I just read from an interview with Axel Wieder in 2016. With This Way, a person can use the work as a tool to really find out in themselves what they can transform by projecting themselves onto the other person. The other person is a symbolic person, but it's also actual. They are not models, we haven't made them up, they are people that have engaged in a step, changed themselves, they have transformed themselves from one person into another. So we have the idea of the nurse and the man from Iraq, the refugee or asylum seeker, and then also the young girl trying to get herself together to face the future. All three people offer a vision of the future, of hope, by transforming an element of their past. They are real things that they had to change for the viewer looking at the work. The idea is to publicly engage the viewer so that they can connect to those people because they are from the same place as themselves. And in the representation, there's something polemical, but something familiar. This is the idea. But then we have the way that it's presented and that it is a multi-channel experience and so on. So it is interesting between these two that obviously learn to understand that it is possible to critically look at the hegemonic discursive way how the world seems to us, and to imagine how it could be differently. And in somehow this is what I would propose as an approach in order to negotiate with reality. But this proposal of negotiating with reality, I see it also very concretely. And very concretely, it was it was, let's say, enacted in the context also of the last Documenta 14, in a project that came into life as a collaboration with a group of people, of activists that are called Society of Friends of Halit. And it is exactly with this name that they were also presented in a space, or presented themselves in the space of Documenta 14. And part of this project was also a collaboration, a commission to forensic architecture. This is, I mean, I can just quickly tell you about the story, but I want to show the beginning of the movie, and then it will talk about the story much better than I could do. It is about a murder, one of several murders in the 2000s, 2006 in this concrete case, 6th of April 2006 in Kassel, one of several racist murders in Germany that for a long time have not been accepted as racist murders until the murders have kind of presented themselves as the so-called National Socialist Underground. And yeah, so it is also about the German police that has not been able or willing to talk about it. It is also about how we are able or not able to see the witness of the families of the murdered people. And I propose that we just look in the beginning of this film by forensic architecture, and then I go on with my presentation. We can talk about it afterwards.
Shortly after 5 p.m., on the 6th of April 2006, Halit Yozgat was found dead behind the counter of his family-run internet cafe in Holländische Straße 82, Kassel, Germany. This was the 9th in a series of 10 killings targeting mainly migrant communities across Germany between 2000 and 2007. The perpetrators were later identified as members of the National Socialist Underground, or the NSU, a neo-Nazi group whose core allegedly consisted of 3 people. The only surviving member of those 3, Beate Zschäpe, currently faces a criminal trial in Munich. During the police investigation into the Kassel murder, it emerged that an intelligence agent of the state of Hesse named Andreas Temme was present at the shop around the time of the murder. He did not disclose this fact to the police, but was later identified from his internet records. In 2015, many of the police records documenting this investigation were leaked. Police reports, witness testimonies, computer and phone logs, and site photographs were made public. Amongst these files was a crucial piece of evidence, a police video showing Andreas Temme's reenactment of his visit to the shop. He sought to demonstrate how he had missed seeing the body of Halit as he exited the shop. Forensic architecture was commissioned by the People's Tribunal, a civil society initiative working with the families of the victims to investigate the validity of Teme's testimony. What time did the murder happen? Where was Teme at that time? Could he not have witnessed the incident? Could Teme's testimony and reenactment be truthful? If not, larger questions could be asked. Working from leaked photographs of the crime scene, we constructed a digital model of the internet cafe. Within those 77 square meters, different actors, the victim, his killers, and a state employee were architecturally disposed in relation to each other. The shop was thus a microcosm for the larger political controversy that ensued. We reduced the model into its most relevant elements and built it as a full-scale installation at the House of World Cultures in Berlin. We then undertook a series of experiments within both the physical and the digital models. Because the murder took place in an internet cafe, every witness was connected to a time-coded device, a computer, or a phone. We located each digital device in the model and constructed a timeline from the login data. This created the space-time matrix within which different possible events could take place. At about 16:30, Halit Yozgat was alone at the counter. The first to come in was 16-year-old Ahmed. He saw Halit at the counter, paid him for half an hour internet access, and went to the back room where the computers were located. He sat at PC 7. At 16:46:03, he logged in and started to play Call of Duty, a popular World War II themed game where players shoot Nazis. The second to enter the shop was 14-year-old Emre. He also paid Halit and went to the back room. Emre sat at PC 3. At 16:48:58, he logged in. He had also come to the cafe to play Call of Duty. The third person to walk in was Hadiya and her 3-year-old daughter. She sat at the telephone booth between the two rooms. She would make 2 phone calls that afternoon. Phone logs record the start of a call within the minute and the end of a call within a second. The last person to go to the back room and log into a computer was intelligence agent Andreas Temme. He said that he parked his car directly in front of the internet cafe. He then entered, saw Halit at the counter, and went directly to the back room. He sat at PC 2. At 16:50:56, he logged into the dating site ilove.de. His username, Wildman70, was what later revealed his presence in the internet cafe. He logged out at 17:01:40 and took 1 minute and 7 seconds to exit the shop according to his reenactment. The last person to enter the shop was Faiz. He was the last person to speak to Halit. He was also the only person to have been in the room when the killing took place. Faiz made 2 phone calls that afternoon. His first call started at 16:54. And his second finished at 17:03:26. When Faiz entered his phone booth, Halit was alive. When he exited, roughly 9.5 minutes later, Halit was already fatally shot. All witnesses present at the shop heard these distinct sounds. Tema was the only one to have told the police that he didn't perceive any exceptional noises. Where was Andreas Tema when the shots were fired? His position in space might suggest his level of culpability. There are 3 possibilities. He could have...
Okay, so as you can see, this is negotiating with reality in a sense, as it is really creating evidence. And this, let's say, forensic investigation that is intervening in a judicial ongoing situation in order to make something thinkable, sayable, visible that has not been said or discussed in the public. So it is an intervention in many senses. It is an intervention in the very concrete forensic debate. It is also a media intervention, and it is of course also an intervention in the way how we understand research, not as something about the world, but as something that has the possibility to intervene in the world. I would like to just look at the end of the video, because I think it is important that it is not only forensic, it also relates to the family, to the witness of the father, and this is also actually how it ends again. So let's just have a look at the last 3 minutes.
Out of the 3 scenarios, we have determined that scenario 1, in which the murder took place after Andreas Tema left the internet cafe, is not possible. The evidence does not exclude scenario 2, in which Andreas Tema was at the front part of the shop when the murder took place. Scenario 3, in which the murder took place while Andreas Tema was still sitting at PC2, is also possible. In this case, he would have witnessed the event. This story suggested layers of violence, misrepresentations, and cover-ups. Halit Yozgat was murdered on the 6th of April, 2006. 20 days later, Andreas Tema reenacted his experience of the event. We reenacted Tema's reenactment to discover it was yet another act of violence, potentially a crime in its own right. Halit's father, Ismail Yozgat, repeatedly asked the court to no avail to visit the shop. If you conducted an inspection of the shop, you would be better able to see for a fact that Tema is making up stories. There are 2 possibilities. Either Mr. Tema himself killed my son, or he noticed whoever it was who killed him. but the state no longer considers Temme a suspect. This, together with the reluctance to unravel the NSU complex, amounts to the continuation of violence by other means.
Okay. Let's go back to my presentation. Yeah. Okay, so I hope that by looking at this, it becomes a bit clearer what I mean when I talk about negotiating with reality. But it is, of course, there is one part of it, and I want to really also stress the fact that this is not only a forensic reenactment. It is also a way to relate to the words of the father that for a very long time have not been taken seriously. But another one could also be speculative fiction. This is also a topic that is important here. One project that we could talk about in this context is by Naomi Rincon Gallardo. It's called Welcome to the Formaldehyde Trip. And actually is a queer, anti-racist, huge reimagination of the world, let's say from the perspective of women warriors. As my time is soon over, I just wanted to have a quick look at the end at one of our projects, the Freethought project at Bergen Assembly 2016, which in itself was, I think, a way to negotiate with reality from all these perspectives I tried to present today. It was a project, a research project by Freethought around the concept of infrastructure in 6 chapters and 3 performative platforms. Just quickly about Freethought. We are a collective working in public research and in curating concepts of urgency. Irit Rogov is a founding figure, and she brought all of us together, and now we work already since 2011, and it is for me a very important process in which I really learned a lot, and it brings me further, together with Stefano Hani, Adrian Heathfield, Massimiliano Molona, and Luis Moreno. So the concept we entered in an ongoing 2 years research project for Bergen Assembly 2016 was infrastructure. At the beginning, we did not understand what it meant. I don't say that we knew it at the end. It was much more about bringing all of our questions around it together, but in a serious way of relating to Bergen, but also relating to a neoliberal world of infrastructures that at the same time became, and since then, even more and more fascist. I just give you a quick run through and then talk about my project in it. There was a concrete negotiation with reality and the space of coming together. Mao Molona worked on a project called The End of Oil and was interested in the infrastructures of oil and what it means for Norway when this ends. Stefano Hani worked together with Fred Moten, Arjuna Neumann, Wu Zhang, and philosopher Denise Ferreira da Silva on a project called Shipping and the Shipped, and insisted on the fact that the history of shipping cannot be separated from a history of the shipped, so brought together infrastructural capitalism with the history of colonialism. Adrian Heathfield worked with Hugo Glendinning on affective labor, on a project of memory also. I just leave it here. Very beautiful movie. And Irit Rogov worked together with actually Solveig Süß, who is here, and Sophie Dyer, who called themselves the Research Architecture Collective at that time, with us on a project called Assembled Archives. And Irit Rogov was looking for how we can remember moments that were not ongoing. How can we remember moments of coming together? She writes that these archives that she assembled in the space of Bergen Assembly help us grasp how content, desire, aspiration, and shared hopes can become a form of substance infrastructure. When a group of people share trajectories within particular historical moments, they may not build lasting structures, but their joint hopes and beliefs to come together in a dense atmosphere, a moment of political vision and solidarity in London, a set of cultural imaginaries in Tehran, the reactions of viewers to exhibitions that have affected them. And actually what you see here is a project that we owe a lot really to this research architecture collective who worked with the historian Mike Berlin on the archive of a coffee house that existed in the 50s for 4.5 years in London called the Partisan Café. It was founded by people who at that time just finished their studies, but then became very important, I guess, for many of us. Stuart Hall, Raphael Samuel, and and oh my God, I think I lose my memory, but it will come. So this coffee house as a place of gathering was one of the archives. Another one was a festival in Tehran, and a third one was a very interesting project of interviews asking people about their affective relation, their relation to exhibitions that have been important for them. I just leave it here. Luis Moreno worked with artist Paul Perges on a project that was called Spectres of Infrastructure. It was a sound installation that actually was looking for the weird ways in which the machine is interacting with us. It was buying books by Amazon related to emotions in the space. Now, when I entered this process, for me it was very interesting to relate to the question of infrastructure from my research question, and this was how we can come together in a world that isolates us, in a world in which we are all the time pushed into pushed into fighting against each other, pushed into being better, pushed into being numbers who are counted against other numbers. And in somehow I was interested in creating a space of coming together, and with this, and I wanted to have a coffee house, of course, critically reflective of the role of coffee houses as spaces of gentrification in the financialized cities of our world, but still a coffee house. And what happened is that we were looking for a space for this coffee house. We wanted to reenact in somehow the Partisan Café, also because the history of this Partisan Café in London in the 50s was related to the New Left Review, and actually trying to think a new left. At that time, thinking a new left from culture as a base, as infrastructure. But good, this is cultural studies. But this idea of the new left seemed interesting for us. And we wanted to think about how to actualize the idea of the partisan, the idea of the Partisan Café. We also talked about rethinking participation from the concept of the partisan and so on. Okay, we were looking for a space. We were shown a very beautiful space in the city center. You can see it here. It is a former fire station in Bergen. And of course, immediately our fantasies started to go on, and we could see the sign of the historical Partisan Café reenacted on this wonderful red brick house, the former fire station. Actually, we were shown two spaces when we were looking for a venue. The former prison and the former fire station. You might realize that both were something else before and might become something else afterwards. So we are, as curators, we are in this transition position, you know, of mobilizing maybe the need of giving these places in the city center another meaning. But the prison was for the cafe, not a place that made sense. So we were very interested in this fire station. And at some point, when we got a longer tour through the house, we learned that unfortunately this space is not quite free because it is occupied. So we realized that we are actually not only the engine of a transformation of a space, but also in somehow brought together in a conflict with people who are occupying this space. So who was occupying this space? A group of retired firemen. The retired firemen of Bergen. They have occupied their former fire station in the moment when the new fire station was built, a bit more outside of the city. It was built because the huge engines that the new ones couldn't enter anymore the historical site. And as we know now from a beautiful video that the artist Isa Rosenberger did, it happened that the existing fire chief called the former fire chief, already retired, and asked him, have you ever heard about occupation? So the guys did it. They just said, yes, we've heard about it, we do it. They moved in their former fire station with the huge engines, with the cars. So this, not that they sleep there every day, but of course, oh shit, I'm sorry. But of course, it's even harder, you know, for the police to get the machines out. So it was occupied. What are we doing? Of course, we have several possibilities. One is to say we do it anyways. The other is to say we look for another place. We visited the space. I mean, we realized that this space is not only very beautiful from the outside and could be a nice space for a cafe, but also has already a museum inside, an amateur museum, because the firemen are not only occupying this space because they don't want it maybe to become used in a commercial way, but they have a concrete dream, a vision. They wanted that the former fire station becomes a fire museum. This was their political aim. This is what they were fighting for. So what does it mean that we would do a partisan cafe in an occupied space? Maybe with the danger to throw out people who are fighting for something else. We had long discussions, what is to be done? Especially when the research question is how can we come together in a world that divides us, that isolates us. And one part was to say, actually, if the space is occupied, we should not negotiate with the city, not with the Bergen Assembly, but with the occupiers, the firemen themselves. We have to meet them. We have to meet them in their meeting space and talk with them and ask them what it means that we are shown this space and if there is any possibility of solidarity. So it was a proposal of a curatorial of a curatorial project of coming together between the ones who are instrumentalized to throw others out and the ones who might be thrown out. How can we come together in a world that divides us? We entered there together and I proposed a possibility to collaborate, actually saying very clearly that if they think it doesn't make sense and if they think this would harm their project more than be solidaric, we would at any point of the process step out. But what I proposed, and then also together with the artist Isa Rosenberger, is to do a temporary alliance around a project that is called the Museum of Burning Questions. And yeah, I mean, we proposed it, and a clear majority was from the beginning for it. Some of the retired firemen had to be convinced or were more suspicious, but at the end they agreed to do it, and we then had the possibility to work on this project, the Museum of Burning Questions, in different, let's say, iterations or different parts. One of them was in the Kunsthalle in Bergen, and here you see the installation of Isa Rosenberger's movie, the documentation of the struggle of the firemen. And the second part was then really in the Brandstation, where we had two enactments of the Museum of Burning Questions. One of them was consisted of guided tours by the retired firemen, where they showed their future museum. So it was a pre-enactment also in this sense. And also I did guided tours where I talked about how this happened and how we decided to work together. And the third one was then really this partisan cafe with a huge program, concerts, discussions, and of course also, again here to come back to this question of representation, presence and pre-enactment, also with a clear relation to the archive that was shown in the first floor with a window to the actualization. Also to make it possible to think critically about what it means to try to actualize a project like that. The whole Bergen Assembly then opened with an infrastructure summit where we were sitting a bit together like here at this academy and had many heated and interesting and discussions that also brought me further. We tried to sit together during lunch as well. Yeah. And I hope that from here I could give you an impression of some theoretical struggles or questions and some practices that might negotiate with reality. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. Wonderful presentation, lecture. We have some time for questions, so maybe you think about it while I come up with the first. I think throughout your lecture, but also in your writing, there is a lot of, you hint a lot on this collective. I mean, it's also in this, free thought is a collective. This approach of a collaboration with the firemen is also hinting on this. So why is this collective effort so important in your thinking at the moment, when at the same time, you know, being critical seems also an individual act quite often. So can you maybe say a little bit about this?
I think that it is almost impossible to imagine another world alone. We are all extremely involved because we have to survive in the existing power relations. So in somehow, I think that the only possibility to maybe also play our positions against each other is to be together. And to be together, to think together, and to do this also in a way in which we learn to go beside or fight all the temptations of resentment that are brought to us, that actually also are part of these divisions. So instead of being guided by these resentments, I propose to be together and to understand that only by coming together and using these differences, also these different positions within the power relations in order to play under them or between them. I see here a possibility to imagine another world and live a part of it already now.
So, questions in the room?
Thank you. I was curious about how you think about artistic and curatorial strategies or roles or responsibilities, how you differentiate between those, if they have different ways of negotiating with the realities, different tasks, different strategies.
Yeah, thank you very much. This question makes, of course, totally sense. First of all, I want to say that artists existed before curators. They also organized themselves and made exhibitions. So at some point, curators were introduced, which doesn't mean that they could not do intellectual work. From my Gramscian I have a perspective that very much relates to Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci, who was the founder of the Communist Party, or one of the founders of the Communist Party in Italy, and then wrote most of his texts in a fascist prison, was thinking about hegemony. Hegemony also as something that is not only that doesn't only function through the power of discipline, let's say, now I say it, but also through consensus and consent. And Gramsci is thinking very much with reform pedagogy, actually. He says, more or less, that every relation of hegemony is an educational relation, and because we learn to consent with the existing power, with the existing hegemony, we can also question it. Now, together with him, I would understand artistic and curatorial intellectual practices as what he calls organic intellectual practices. And again, here this could be an answer to the question before. Organic intellectual practices cannot be imagined individually. They are conceptually collective. Now, for me, it is important to say, if these practices, these ways of coming together and to question the existing power relations, if we take this seriously as the role of artists and curators, then from this lens, I could not make a difference. Now, of course, the society we live in makes a difference, and these two positions have another also historical role in society. The artists learn from when they come to the university that they should maybe even try not to all the time function within the existing imaginations and moralities and so on. While curators have another tricky role, they should at the same time be the bureaucrats and the activists. So they should in somehow translate between activist artists on one side and institutions on the other. I propose that we take the roles that we are given and we use the skills that we got from there, that we come together and question the existing power relations. What artists can do here is that obviously, and I think we have seen it also with the example from forensic architecture, they don't have to be afraid to take the freedom to go outside of the, let's say, pretty clear frontiers of the judicial discourse, for example, or of what we would understand by science and so on. So I think that artists have shown, always, but also in the last years, that they have a huge contribution to make to the question of what we can know. Maybe because the knowledge institutions became also more and more narrow. And to get out of the narrow is part of what artists do and can do. What can curators do? I think actually we can use this position that we are in, this position within the institution and the institutional critique, let's say, or the institutional counter-imagination.
Thank you very much for a very nice talk. I was interested, could you say something more about the non-human actors? Non-human actors part of the common, and also about their creative potential, especially the last example was very nice in that aspect. So.
I am actually the only way how I have really seriously engaged in this question is the museum itself. So I am I'm absolutely not an expert in what you're asking for. Concerning the museum, I have been very interested in looking at the museum as a place where there is an afterlife, also of the violence that is inscribed in the things there. So that we can look at collections also as places where the things are doing something with us. And if we go and enter and see museums not only from the perspective of how these things are kind of organized to tell us something, but also how, if we really encounter them, how they might do something with us, then there might be a proposal to break out of these, let's say, often powerful representational discourses. But this is the only answer I can give to that, so others might be much more informed.
Questions?
I was wondering, you just reflected on what you think that curators and artists can do in relation to the institutions, and I was wondering, what do you think that people within the institutions can do to accommodate the artists and the curators? Do you have a vision on that?
Sorry, I was just, sorry. I think I will ask you to say it again, but first I wanted to go back to this because it resonated still. Did you mean that the engines were acting? I mean, it's very Latourian, no? The big cars were actually the actors in the fire station. We can imagine this as well. Yeah, it's true. I mean, the fact that these big cars are there makes it possible that the firemen don't have to sleep there. So it's an alliance between the firemen and the material that they have worked with all their lives. It's a beautiful thought. Thanks for that. Sorry, and now I ask you to say it again.
Yeah, no problem. So I just said, you just talked about the role of the artist and the curator in relation to the institution, and I was wondering if you have a vision on what people within the institution can do to accommodate the artists and the curators.
Thank you for helping me to clarify this. Actually, I didn't talk about curators only from outside. I deeply believe in the possibility to align between the curators from inside, the curators from outside, the activists and the artists. I think it is. I think that institutions are not owned by the existing politicians, also not owned by the existing political situation. There's a longer history, and there will be a future after that, and we can also insist and persist to that, also from within the institution. And the only way how I see that this can work is in alliances, and also in admitting that at some moment alliances don't work. So not pushing people inside if it doesn't make sense.
Okay, one last question. We're a bit behind schedule, so if no question, then thank you, Nora.